Okay, I'm Marc Cousins. I want my time. And
you got it.
I'm going to make an argument. I thought I'd try and bring in a kind of novelty. And I represent the two things that have been really despised here. One, theory. It's a matter of amazement to me why theory is always linked to masturbation. I mean, that is so weird. Secondly, that apparently you all despise masturbation. I mean, I'm tempted to say, I don't believe you. So there's obviously a kind of topic one day to give a lecture on theory and masturbation, without like it sounding like, you know, a sort of schoolmaster's condemnation. Actually, both theory and masturbation raise extremely interesting issues. The second, obviously extremely unpopular thing that I represent is an abiding interest in psychoanalytic thought. Now, there's no point me giving a kind of 10-second lecture on why Freud was important. I thought I'd kind of just give about 2-minute analytic interpretation of something, and you'll see whether it has any value or not. As I'm sure in one way or another, you must be aware that in the last fortnight, the AA has been going through a sort of periodic kind of set of upheavals. There have been arguments, rows, there have been meetings. I don't want to go into that side of it. But it was quite, I mean, spirited, I think, would be an understatement. People were very angry. People were angry from the other side. I mean, so it went on. We ended up, bizarrely, in a kind of meeting called for the first time by membership. There were a lot of rather ancient people there who were driven to make their point, which they made quite clearly. Had they been logical, they would have put the motion at the end of the meeting, which is, Alvin must go. It was the only kind of logical outcome for their position. He was described variously as a thug. So, yes, but he was our thug. So I just want to kind of pose, in a sense, equally to both sides in this debate, a psychoanalytic interpretation. It's clear to anyone who has spent as long here working that students use this, and I say this without a scintilla of sentimentality. The building's very important in their life as their life. Anyone who does something good, like add some more buildings to it, is actually doing something that is going to be good in the future, but actually it's extremely difficult to negotiate it in the present. Because, and you heard some students say it, the increase of space threatens us. I think that's a very interesting thing to say and should be taken seriously. It was a sort of spatial reflex, right? The second thing is, people who kind of are worried about the space that they own, I don't mean own in any legal sense, I mean that you must own the space you're in if you're to inhabit it. But as I say, I don't mean it in a legal sense. Then it can't be a very good idea suddenly to kind of have sort of, I don't know what they were, sort of some space planners who looked as though they'd sort of even failed the exam at space syntax, and who could be seen here for a few months doing research. Obviously, their research was based on the idea that the central problem, spatially, for the AA, was a problem of circulation. I mean, it was difficult to kind of go and say, actually, it's not a problem. You know, they're doing all this measurement of people going from one place to another. Let me kind of say from my point of view, as a non-architect, it was sublimely silly. I could go on like this. But the interpretation would be that if you're actually physically going to touch the relation of people to the building, it's not that this has any implications for what you should or shouldn't do, but you should be very careful. You should know what nerve you're stepping on. Of course nerves have to be stepped on, but you do it, knowing what you're doing. And that really applies, I think, to everyone. So I'm saying that I don't think psychoanalytic interpretation is irrelevant in spatial conditions, especially when they're contested ones. So that's my first point. But now I want to turn to Patrik's book. It says in various parts that it's, in some sense, a work of theory. So my first question really is, it's a work of architectural theory, but what sort of theory and to what end? What could it achieve and what are the limitations? The limitations almost, I don't want to go through kind of contesting any particular arguments. I'm trying to kind of characterize the book. It seems to me the book is an uneasy tension between, as it were, two kinds of theory. I say two kinds because I mean theories that are going in different directions. And I'm not going to try and demonstrate this so much from Patrik's book, but to show you what happens to it in social and sociological theory in general, including Marx. In fact, it'll be Marx that I take some of my references from, neither in support nor against, just to show what he's doing. Now, at one level, the book, insofar as it's not only about architecture, but it's about the place, function, space, whatever you want to call it, of architecture in society. Someone said that it was quite an old-fashioned book, and I mean that seems to me not a criticism, but in some sense I think it's true. I mean I don't use this to denigrate it in any ways. It's very much the kind of book that people often wrote in the 1950s as an attempt to have a general theory of society. In that sense, it mimics the Luhmann kind of project. Not only a general theory of society, but a theory of like what the regions of that society, call them what you want, politics, art, science, I think are the three, mentioned. So now what these books all share, despite their absolute difference in conclusions, whatever, is that they insist on taking society as a totality. As a totality, that means it's a single thing. It adds up to a totality, and it has to add up to a totality in order then that the regions can be assigned a particular character and a particular function. Also, you have to be able to know this. So it's not only a totality, but you have to propose how that totality is kind of done. So you could say of any global sociological theory, it would be from Marx, let's say. It would also be, I mean, the one that put me in mind, which people don't read anymore, but is actually Talk at Parsons. If I don't know if anyone here has ever read it, probably not. It was, Harvard's attempt in the 50s to have a general theory of society that wasn't Marxist, was more kind of functionalist. It used Max Weber. It's central kind of, because each of these general theories has to have a fundamental substance which make it all stick together. In Marx's case, it's obviously the category of labor. In Weber's case, it's obviously the category of action. Obviously, in Luhmann, the name of the glue is communication. At one level, it doesn't really matter what you call it. It's the way it functions as the glue. Now, this all supposes that you want a theory of the social totality, and that you're prepared to pay the enormous theoretical costs which come with it. The cost, in my mind, is that it all requires an investment of what may be a kind of unintentional, but nonetheless real, functionalism. You end up, no matter even if you're opposed to functionalism, assigning this or that the general function of reproducing this or that. So any theory of the social totality comes with a very kind of price, which is a lot of functionalism. That means you've got to have, as part of it, and this is one of the problems, a form of causality. You've got to be able to show what form of causality works. Obviously, in a sense, the most simple one is Hegel. Hegel has a notion, which Althusser rightly describes as expressive causality. Everything, if you can, cut a culture, a society, you can do a cross-section of it. Everything revealed by the cross-section is all linked, because each one is linked to the Geist, which is the thing that also links them all. It becomes a kind of tautology. Others don't have such a kind of simple causality. And one of the major tasks, theoretical tasks in the 60s in Paris, is whether or not, I use the name Althusser, but there were other people as well, we're going to be, in some sense, able to drag Marx's theory of the totality into a 20th century. That is to say, to look at new problems of causality on the one hand, and the epistemological question, how you knew this thing, on the other hand. That was the task. To my mind, that task failed. So there are enormous, what you might call, prices to pay. And then you're really writing about society and architecture's part in it. At one level, especially in a room like this, that's of limited, you might think, interest. It's of interest to a sociologist because they're precisely interested in how do the bits of society fit together with society as a whole. Then you can move to the region itself, like architecture. Now here, it seems to me, the tendency in the book is to adopt a different form of reasoning. Let's call the first reasoning, the wish to have a social theory and the elements of the social that come with it. The second, and from the 18th century, it constructs itself as this and calls itself critique, right? Now, people forget. If you got a penny for every time you went into the bookshop and people say, critique of contemporary architecture, actually it's a book that just slags off contemporary architecture and thinks slagging off is the same as critique. A critique is a very specialized instrument. It means, and it's one of the justifications for theoretical work, that you can take something, shall we say, like a literature, but it could be a corpus of paintings, or it could be a group of buildings, or it could be some combination of all three. And it says, with some of them, if you group them together, you can say they constitute the current state of a practice, and because you're able to do this, which has a degree of autonomy. It's not just making an empirical claim that architecture through its profession or whatever has a certain separation from society. It's that there is something like a practice which has a certain autonomy. But it's a kind of open-ended autonomy because it's not capable of being defined. Or rather, it is ceaselessly defined and redefined. Right? So anyone who wants to argue in a sense, the autonomy of architecture as a discursive practice has to do something rather like Marx when he does a critique. And I want just to describe what Marx does and then come back to it and ask, what its implications would be in architecture. Marx famously announces on the title page of Das Kapital that Das Kapital, the subtitle is A Critique of Political Economy. He doesn't say a well-funded research project on whatever's going on in Manchester. And indeed, he's absolutely polemical against the idea that it is some new local event in Manchester. He says in the preface, mostly to those Russian revolutionaries who think that Russia can go from feudalism to socialism without the intervening stage of capitalism, he says, "Date fabula narrata," of you the story is told. You know, this is going to happen to you. Now,
which was true.
What? They did have.
Delayed capitalist systems going to go through.
Well, I suppose first they had socialism and then they had capitalism.
Okay.
Well, actually, someone was once interviewed in the Soviet Union for an important post. And he's asked one of those questions like, "Comrade, please describe capitalism." He says, "Oh, it's a system in which man exploits man." Oh, that's very good. Now, what about socialism? He says, "Oh, it's the other way round." Now, central, if you read the first 3 volumes, and indeed the 3 volumes on surplus value in Marc's, I'm sitting next to the only other person in this room, I think, who's done it. What it means is he goes through the arguments of what he calls political economists. They're pretty much 2, Smith and Ricardo. And although he doesn't agree with them necessarily, he thinks that they belong to the autonomy of political economy, which has, as it were, within its grasp, an analysis of what he calls the laws of capitalism. So much so that he thinks that you can work out the real account of capitalism by theoretically working on their works, finding the contradictions, in a sense putting them right, i.e. a theoretical, what became known as theoretical practice. It's a way of conducting materials for a critique. Right? Now, of course, so that's how you have an autonomous. If you translate that back into architecture, it means, in a sense, that you nominate those buildings, writers, whatever, that constitute real architecture. And you can, from the point of theoretical speculation and whatever, and indeed architectural design, work on that critique to produce the next round of the critique, which is not criticism, it's knowledge. It's knowledge and can be, as much an artistic or indeed architectural practice. So that's a very tempting kind of path for defending the autonomy of a form of knowledge or the autonomy of a form of practice. But it too comes with a very high price. And the high price, to put it crudely, let's talk about Marx, is that he has to have some mechanism of distinguishing whose writings belong to what he calls real political economy and whose writings belong to vulgar political economy, i.e. writings of economists, but they're not to be taken seriously because they're just ideological kind of, they're just for the bosses, in effect. People like Nassau Senior. So the whole enterprise depends on drawing up, in a sense, a corpus. It could be works, it could be buildings, it could be paintings, which, you work on. But somehow, you've got to make this fundamental decision as to what belongs inside the definition of work to be done on it to get to the next stage, and what doesn't belong to it. What, in Marx's terms, is called vulgar political economy. In a sense, in architecture, this gets muddled up, actually, with very traditional arguments about things like canons. Or even, in a sense, the autonomy becomes the defense of what you might call traditional. Not, I hasten to add, traditional in the traditional sense, but where tradition is that ceaseless kind of reworking of some stuff, but not every stuff. Right? I mean, it's very strange. I mean, by what right is Alberti a point of rhetorical reference? I'm not opposing it. It's a question of asking for what, by what token does he get quoted and not Filaretti? Do we have reasons for that? Part of them lie in this problem. Now, both these debts, these very high prices, they also tend to conceal themselves. They tend to conceal themselves because the books tend to be very long. But they're for real. So it doesn't seem to me, in terms of architecture, you really need, it's not a major task. I mean, I don't mean it's a minor task. It's not really a task to produce a theory of society which accounts for architecture's place in it. If people must do that, it doesn't seem to me it's a task necessarily for architects. Indeed, it might help not to be an architect. I mean, there's a long tradition in England of architects translating famous foreign architecture texts. The last one you may still use, the Joseph Rickfert's edition of Alberti, which used to be referred to by my supervisor, Gombrich, as mistranslated by Rickfert. The point is that being an architect, interestingly here, puts you in the very worst place because you're always likely to impose your own architectural terms on a historical period when they weren't relevant or developed. Hence the tendency to talk about the Quattrocento and to assign to it things like plans or whatever in a purely anachronistic way. Really, I've tried to say this afternoon that there are theoretical enterprises. Of course I would, because in some sense I'm on the side of theory. But both the ones that seem to make their appearance in this book, if Patrik would agree that elements of both are in them, they both have a sort of, to my mind, a very high price. And I'm not sure that they can address...
Worth paying?
Well, I don't know. That depends on well, I can say, well, let's wait for volume 2. Thank God for a polite answer. Yeah, well, I mean, and, so I don't know. You'll have to judge from the earlier, more polemical discussion. I don't know. It's a slightly kind of surreal sight. I mean, it feels like sort of, with Patrik, sort of Lenin read through Ayn Rand.
Well,
okay.
Oh, thanks a lot. I mean, appreciate this, and as you know, the first 10 years of my intellectual development was dedicated to Marx, and I worked through all 3 volumes, plus the theories of surplus value and other works. And it is the most impressive intellectual endeavor, which is absolutely no masturbation at all, because it was tied to organizing political action, building a party, and changing the world. But I do believe that Luhmann's system in a different era was the more fertile framework, and I just pose that as a choice. It's no necessity. I mean, I think the difference here is also, and I make that very explicit, we're in a post-metaphysical era. These are contingent choices of taking up a theoretical edifice. You can create it out of architecture, and you work through and think through, and if things fall into place, make sense, and deliver some kind of project and guidance. And I'm careful to move from the very abstract categories to a fully operationalized set of instructions in end of volume 2. And I think it's not only a price worth paying, but a price you can't avoid to kind of pay or take the risk, but I'm particular on the concept of society as a totality. I'm also very explicit about that. That it is also that architecture needs to be seen as a kind of subtotality, and that is an axiom or premise of the discourse, which I believe have a lot of indications that this is the case in terms of world architecture more than ever with the internet, and every project we submit is posted and circulating that integrates more than ever into a single unified discourse which can have multiple trajectories. So I believe in the totality of society. Clearly, I mean, there is an integralness, I believe, to a social organization or to a social system, and the level of society, in particular the way it in the 19th century it kind of demarcated and forged itself with the national boundaries on a territory and the build-up of a state with particular legal systems, economic systems, money, a universal, set of education provisions. That is a form of totality, and you have to, and there's a kind of systemness to these. And now, of course, it's much more tenuous to claim that there is world society, what Luhmann is going on, but there is clearly, I would argue, a world science, a world architecture. And so I'm not afraid. I'm not so if it's a claim, but it's, I think, a valid and worthwhile hypothesis of anything, which I'm kind of.
Can I just add a footnote to that? Because I mean,
I don't see the problem with totality or the problem with.
Patrik agrees. That absolutely he does accept the idea of a social totality, but he also recognizes it's a claim. That is to say, it's not self-evident. And I, for one, would completely reject the idea of a social totality. I think social relations tend to be discontinuous. I think they carry on at separate times. I don't think they're bound together by any fundamental glue, and I don't think there is a causality which would explain the interconnection of everything with everything else. Now, those are two simply opposed views. In his terms, you have to make a contingent choice between them. But it does also, Patrik was using the very term world, to indicate the solidity and the reality of these phenomena. If you take a different view, that you actually analyzes discourses from a much more nominalist point of view, you now have on Radio 3, I can't stand it, but on Saturday afternoons they have something called world music. You can imagine that it got called world music because actually, they were told to not have classical music on a Saturday afternoon and to have something popular, but they just couldn't stand the word popular on Radio 3, so they called it world. Actually the reason why terms like world appear, seem to me to be internal to the discursive forms of production. They don't indicate, they're not reference in a direct or self-evident way to the fact that there is a world. I think all debates like this, there are two terms which make everything kind of uninteresting and unthinkable. One is reality, and the other is representation. Both those terms, I think, a reality is like the sort of absentee landlord in theoretical discussions. It's always kind of wheeled in as, where the rent has to go. I don't think there's anything called reality, except possibly in the Freud sense that what is reality is simply what is an obstacle to you. So it's things you keep bumping into. And nor do I think there's representation, because I think, an enormous interest in the arts and in architecture is diluted and possibly even extinguished by treating everything as a species of representation. But as I say, as he would say, that's just a view.
I agree. A lot of these insights are kind of recuperated in the Luhmann's discourse, which I pick up. For instance, yes, the idea of reality as maybe an obstacle, as an infringement, as a disruption of the routine, need to adapt, to refine themselves. because we're talking about autopoietic systems. Yes, they're kind of linguistic system, languages, worldview. All these is within there, and in terms of architecture knows its end is near. If established architects keep losing competition after competition, if the resources don't flow back, that's the way reality knocks on the door of the discourse, as a kind of disruption of its usual routines, which construct semblances of quote-unquote reality. But each of these discourses has a so-called world reference. That's denoted by the concept of function, and there's an internal reference denoted by the concept of form. But I think you've asked the question: who should architects be interested in locating their discipline within the encompassing society? I think that's for me a self-evident necessity. And I've discussed my theory as a unified theory, as a comprehensive theory, as a super theory, and I'm add one more thing to it. It's one of what I call the so-called self-descriptions, which architecture has produced intermittently and periodically from day one of its emergence. Alberti wrote the first self-description of the emergent architecture, and it's a treatise which is which has the reflection on the societal function of architecture. And volume 2, I've dedicated a whole chapter of going through 3 critical paradigmatic self-descriptions of the discipline, where people think large, locate the trajectory of the discipline in an encompassing societal context, place a series of demands, and then go through the categories and prescriptions all the way through. And that's Alberti's work. That's for the neoclassical period. I looked at Durand and his lectures on architecture, and for the modernist era, I'm looking at Le Corbusier's Towards the New Architecture. These are very ambitious accounts of what architects' role is, architecture versus revolution, the way it needs to take up and can take up an universalized scope within an industrial society. There's a theory of society as a progressive society, as an industrial society, as a theory of modernization underlies modernism. And I think there hasn't been one since then. I think Corbusier is still the most quoted work of architecture. It lasted throughout for 50 years. No work really replaced it. Of course, there was Gideon's space-time architecture, which is also a big scope. And I think then there is perhaps Christian Norberg-Schulz's Intentions in Architecture, which is at the edge of modernism, when new conditions are folded in, new intelligences are incorporated, which Gestalt psychology and the attempt to incorporate more sophisticated sociology. And that's the last attempt, and I think it's absolutely overdue. And that's why I'm saying, if you have whole schools like the Bartlett in kind of tailspin self-destruction, you need to, this is valuable, and of course you find your way intuitively. The discipline has developed a route out of the crisis of modernism, has learned the lessons of postmodernism, deconstructivism, folding into parametricism, I believe. But since this project is still hasn't come out of the cut, hasn't kind of seeded fully, I think that I need to go on to the offensive, as it were, and I've all the way through I've had the ambition to locate and guide what I'm doing in the large picture. I don't think there's any avoidance of this, and you find that in all subsystems of society, you find that the political system has political theory, the economic system has economic theory, the system of the sciences has the science of philosophy, which becomes pragmatist, so all of these have upgraded, sophisticated versions of what Luhmann calls reflection theories, and also sometimes called self-descriptions. These are in effect different from sciences. So the reflection theory of architecture is not a science about architecture, because it starts with maybe empirical descriptive account, draws in the most sophisticated theories of society and philosophy and epistemologies to guide itself, but then moves normative and prescriptive, like jurisprudence isn't a science. But jurisprudence is at the highest level, is doing precisely that. And some people within the legal system or within that subsystem, do attempt the self-description of the legal system and make an account of the purpose, function, trajectory, potentialities of the law in contemporary society, and they become normative / projective. They're still just offerings. And they have to have a large degree of veracity in a sense of being tied into what's going on anyway. These are not kind of utopias which are divorced, which try to debunk and rubbish what goes on. They need to be 95% description and 5% projection. And I think that's the way this has to be read. And I think that the society as a totality is, I still don't know, I mean, let's say it is the only viable productive working hypothesis but I feel in my bones that it's a reality, because I'm in a different part of this planet every other week, and I speak to people who speak my language, who've seen the work, who are confronted with similar challenges, and the events which are unfolding in the Middle East radiate through everything, put a crack in many issues. I mean, I don't see, there's a fragility, a totality, which strikes me as a world economic system. Can you accept that, at least on the level of economics, this is an integrated world system where little imbalances in the food prices and the price of oil are not radiating through and impacting everybody?
The point is a pretty theoretical one. No one needs to question the interconnectedness of things in the world. That's non-problematic. They do not have, that interconnectedness does not have to be represented as forming a totality. Indeed, once you're dogmatically certain it's a totality, you'll be certain that everything always is interconnected, even if it is or not. I.e., the question of interconnectedness as evidence is evidence of interconnectedness, not of a social totality. That's one thing. Second thing is,
semantics.
You brought, well, that's not a semantic point. I mean, it's a theoretical point. The second thing is you brought up the, yes, you're right. In jurisprudence, people reflect on the law, but there's a great problem making a kind of comparison with architecture. I know this because I just finished the book by, I suppose he's Lord Bingham, ex-Lord Chief Justice, who wrote a popular book, came out last month, called The Rule of Law. Here he is, the head judge, as it were, reflecting on the following issues. The nature of the rule of law, what is meant by a fair trial, what is meant by a crime and punishment, what is meant by the current increase of legal recognition for human rights, whatever. My point being that as he surveys, as it were, these jurisprudential questions, their relevance is almost, obvious for citizens. I'm not saying they're going to read it, but he's in a sense pushing on an open door. One of the problems for architectural writing is surely the problem not so much of explaining what architecture is in a world, but why everyone misunderstands and doesn't understand and is plain stupid about architecture. I mean, that is to say, to go back to Freud, you take architecture, if you're interested in public discourse, as some kind of symptom. Why is it in this country that a large number of people happen to think that, someone who really is pernicious and as daft as a brush, and if his IQ was 1 point lower, you'd have to water him. I refer to the Prince of Wales. And actually, if you went in '88 to that exhibition on a vision of Britain, a lot of men are going around saying to their wives, Dorothy, I think this is absolutely right. You know, I mean, it's extraordinary to have seen it. In a sense, that it seems to me a question of discursive struggle within architecture, and I don't think there are any easy answers, but how do you argue the architectural in the face of overwhelming, not only kind of ignorance, but kind of hostility? Because that surely, you know, in a way that Bingham doesn't have to. I mean, the jurisprudence has a, you know, as I say, it's pushing on an open door. That's only a question. I mean, I have no idea what the answer is.
I wonder if it's possible to shift from totality to universality, because regardless as to whether the particular prescriptions that come out of a manifesto that seems implied in your whole objective, one might say that the idea of a theory presupposes that one can make some universal claim about the subject of your discourse, and that in turn entails some basis on which you can claim universality. And I think this is slightly different from the social notion of a totality. And I wonder, is there another basis on which we can consider the notion of universality and the idea of a theory, regardless as to whether your particular theory has nailed it or not?
Well, I mean, one of the statements is also ring not so much of its time, is the statement that each of the function systems, and particular architecture / the design disciplines, have unique, exclusive, and universal competency with respect to everything, all built environments, and the totality of the world of artifacts like this, and this. Anything produced, anything circulating and inhabited in direct interface with human communication, by the way, not desalination plants and machinery and underground systems. This is engineering's business. But everything which surrounds us, we touch, construct, it produces, exists only because it's gone through the needle's eye of the discourse we are in charge of. That's what I say, where universality comes in, and that universality was first established by the modernists. They included the site of work, the factory, because people are the mass housing, utilitarian structures where people interact and communicate, whereas our prior architecture was not universal. It was a partial claim, a subset, for instance, of the totality of the built environment and of the world of the artifactual was still in handicraft. But I think since modernism, you can see it in the Bauhaus, they have made universal claim, and they've transformed the material production and reproduction of society on a universal scale, all the way from the furniture, product design, architecture to urbanism, and they succeeded. That's the way I see, and that's in the sense that universality functions and, as it were, radiates through and takes grip. That the Bauhaus did that is also another indication of that the world is become a totality, and that doesn't mean that there's still pockets of that there aren't pockets of how they call it, dysynchronous development and underdevelopment.
Can I ask, I just want to ask Marc one quick question. And let me make an observation. You know, clearly Patrik is interested in architecture for collectives. So the role of psychology and psychoanalytic thought is probably too located in the individual in relationship to the built environment, maybe. But when you were pointing out the problem of space and the issues, the interesting thing about that is the promiscuity and indifference of the cathexis to a particular building are from its architectural qualities. So even though we always have a psychological and psychoanalytic relationship to the built environment that we live in, there's no evidence to show that that allows us to make any discriminations about the qualities of the building. So
No. Well, I mean, the question gives me an opportunity to kind of say, first of all, psychoanalysis is not actually about the individual. I mean, it really needs to be nailed on the head. It's kind of said so often in a kind of cliched way. If you think about it, I mean, what he gets may come from individuals, but what he asks is a very non-individual question. Freud always asks a sort of Kantian question, which is, if a patient says this, what kind of a thing must the mind be like in order to generate it?
right. So there is a
So, you know, you'll get things like, which are obviously non-individual, like the description of a neurosis. A neurosis may be, as it may be or not, acted out by an individual, but it's not an individual, it's not a category of an individual person. And many of the phenomena that he's talking about, things like resistance, regression, are absolutely as much collective as they are individual. They're the incidence at which any of these processes fall can be at the individual, at the level of the collective, at the level of humanity as such, even at the level of particular nations.
But I wanted to get them, I mean, this is actually, I need some instruction on this, because she said something that seemed self-evident, and it wasn't self-evident to me, and that is the problem Marx faces, and is his, the means by which he discriminates vulgar and pertinent. I don't, what's wrong with that? Isn't that how a discipline constructs itself inevitably and always? Aren't we obligated to, in fact, do that, knowing that it's constantly going to be debated and evolve?
I think probably, I mean, it's an interesting question, how disciplines distinguish,
Last
like
point.
literature and whatever that's relevant, and that's just stupid and off the wall. This is a more sophisticated version of it. But the point is that Marx is assigning such radically different values to each type. I mean, the vulgar economy is just putting into words a justification for the employer's position. Within the critique, there's basically Adam Smith and Ricardo.
Can I come in here?
Sorry,
Can-
just
can
this
I
is the
come
last
in here?
sentence.
Yeah.
And this can lead, I mean, it could lead nowhere, in a sense. The assertion that it leads nowhere is most waspishly put by Michel Foucault when he said Karl Marx, yes, a minor post-Ricardian. Thank you.
No. I think it's interesting, this point in particular, I think you didn't do justice to Marx, because it shows that because Marx is going beyond the specific domain, he's not an economist in the narrow sense, but somebody who's constructing a total theory of society as a totality. He is able to, he has a selection criterion and a theory about the necessary vulgarization of economics in a period of fomenting class struggle where the bourgeoisie itself can no longer afford to fully reveal the workings of its systems. You know what I mean? Yeah.
He criticizes your book because he
Yeah.
notices an expression of critique totalities, and he lays out the problem that we are therefore obligated to study canon and develop a canon,
Yeah.
which is how I teach, for example.
That's
what
true.
I want to know is is there, if you
Alternative.
want to avoid that problem, what is an alternative?
There is no alternative. And what I feel is, but there's an obligation. Obviously, it mustn't be an arbitrary imposition. You can't just select the canon intuitively. You have to, of course, rationalize and explicate and find criteria. And that's where you, to justify that, and that's where as you develop those criteria and you critique the selection of the canon, which is initially hypothesis and intuitive, being drawn to it, you keep expanding the theory, you keep expanding the reflective loops until you reach, and for me this is clear, until you reach the embeddedness of a theory of architecture in a total theory of society, which you can't invent yourself, which you have to rely on philosophers and sociologists and that discourse to deliver as something for you to kind of plug into and relate to and draw yourself out to. That would be the demand. Otherwise, the problem is that oftentimes where there isn't that level of sophistication or penetration, the canon is just selected and stipulated and not rationalized or reasoned and explained. And I think that's the ambition here, is that the canon is, yes, there is a canon, but it sets itself to contingent to some extent, but it also, the challenge is also to bring in a different canon with more penetrating arguments, rather than to reject the task or agenda of setting out a canon. As you said, you do it, we do it, everybody has to do it. It's an unavoidable thing to be done, and the price we have to pay is the sense of risk, is the sense of degrees of arbitrariness, which I'm chipping away on working through. And that's the difference between science and design, or kind of a reflection tree of a profession which is bound to act fast, where science can always take more time, critique a further round, postpone, and the contribution is a negative, a critical. We are bound to act fast in conditions of uncertainty and risk taking, and that's why this is for somebody who, like Marc, who is more of a scientist in inverted commas than a professional. Yes, there are kind of risks taken. There are kind of positions taken up, rationalized to some degree, but then there is that necessity to choose and act. I'm sorry, I'm taking that last word because we got to go into the next session after a short break. Thank you, Marc.